Hello and welcome to this RTS panel discussion. I'm James Bennett, Managing Director of Televisual, and over the next hour or so I hope we can cover quite a lot of ground and take on a journey as we explore the impact of US high-end television inward investment on the UK production ecology. How predictable is this investment and how sustainable is it? And why the UK? We look through the prism of the studio's investment across the country and what the UK has to offer. What are the implications for UK indies and supply chain? And are we ready for this change? And what do we need to be mindful of to ensure all is in place? To help you navigate through these choppy waters and perhaps find dry land, I'm joined by what I can only describe as the perfect panel. We have Jane Millichip, Chief Content Officer at Sky Studios. We have Wayne Garvie, President International Production at Sony Pictures Television. We have Seetha Kumar, CEO of ScreenSkills. And we have Roger Morris, Managing Director of Elstree Studios. Context is everything. And the latest statistics from both Ofcom and the BFI are both exhilarating and alarming. In this first slide, we can graphically see just how rapidly UK viewing habits have changed over a 3-year period. The relevant shift from the perspective of our discussion is that from linear live PSB television to streamer on-demand content. In this next slide, we can see how UK PSB spend on originated content has diminished over the last 15 years by just shy of 30% before taking inflation into account. And these stats predate the pandemic, from which we believe the PSBs come away with even more limited funding. As a caveat, it is worth adding that funding from non-PSBs on original British content is now over $1 billion in 2019 and 2020. According to the Commercial Broadcasters Association. And now for some headlines. In 2019, film and high-end television production spend in the UK was over £2 billion, with £1.6 billion coming from inward investment. That's over 3/4. And early figures from the BFI suggest this was at least repeated in 2020, with 76% coming from the streamers. And this figure is sure to be revised upwards. High-end television spend increased by 93% over the last 5 years, with a 51% increase in 2019 from 2018. And with a headline-grabbing $1 billion inward investment from Netflix alone in 2020. The increase in HETV funding is forecast to be in excess of $4 billion by 2024-25. I'm going to turn here to Wayne first and thinking about UK production talent. What does UK production talent have to offer? You know, from when we were talking before, you were talking about the actors and how the actors had such a profound impact on the success of the UK, or keeping the UK's presence visible. Is that the case?
Well, I suppose I start from a slightly different position from Roger, whereas I think our strength in television, to use an old-fashioned term, is because it never really had a film industry in Britain, whereas in America they had a film industry. So, and also in Britain, we've been very good, it seems to me, at embracing high and low culture. So you can be Sir Peter Bazalgette and you can make Big Brother, and yet you can also be, on the Opera House or whatever. We've been, I'm using that as a strange example perhaps, but we've always embraced that. And then, so if you track through what's happened in our country, when the sudden explosion of streaming services, in particular for high-end premium drama content, why were our creatives ideally placed for that? One, because we've got a very strong TV industry. Secondly, the language thing, obviously. Thirdly, we're creative entrepreneurs. We've been creative entrepreneurs for at least 40 years, longer probably. And we've had to do that because we're a small island and we've had to go out and sell our wares, and we've been very adept. America, I'm sure we'll talk about this again, working for an American studio, as Jane does now, they're the most insular country in the world, and their size means they haven't had to be exporting in the way that we've done that. And then you look at things like our theatre. I mean, we've got unbelievable quality acting talent, haven't we? I mean, it's quite extra. And you saw that the Crown alone, the Golden Globes, the Critics' Choice Awards, the Oscars, it's unbelievable. No one can come close to us. So we have something that's been built up. And also, I think the other thing that I always bang on about is that we have a culture of innovation, actually, which again stems from our fundamental belief in public service broadcasting, which has kept the rest of our industry in the right place. I.e., we don't chase just commercial titles. We are a business, but actually we're always thinking about innovation. Actually, and I think those are pretty key reasons.
But thinking back to America, you talk about it being insular, and that's kind of a key threat, isn't it, to the whole growth and explosion in high-end TV?
Well, I mean, I often say this to people: the streaming service has been fantastic. There's absolutely no doubt, and you know, I benefited more than most people from the support of a Netflix and then Amazon and so on. They've been brilliant, and we can talk about the things that they do differently to our traditional broadcasters. But you have to remember, these are American companies who there's a reason why America still talks about the domestic market and the rest of the world. And we'll find that most of the high-end budgets go on American content, even if that's featuring British actors, etc. That they're focused on that they all go to school together, they all hang out together. It's a very small industry in Los Angeles, and that's really what matters to those individuals. And still, they find it very difficult to understand, even though the rest of the world is a huge market and growth potential for them. Really, it's very difficult to understand and to break away from the strength of your domestic market. You know, but that market in America is completely, I mean, Jane will be very good on this as well, is that, you know, their television industry has been built on a particular model that's existed for 40, 50 years, which is pilot seasons, international screenings, long-running shows that you flog around the world, and you make your money in long term. That world has gone. It's within the last 5 years. You know, American network television is in dire straits. And all the investment and all the creative things are going towards streaming services. And indeed, the companies have all reorientated themselves around their streaming services.
Where did high-end television come up from to be able to supply the streaming market?
Well, it's a demand-based economy, and as quality is improved, the bar is much higher than it was 20 years ago. We've had a fantastic purple patch in high-end television in the last few years, and now the bar is very, very high, and we, you know, lower that bar at your peril. Now, the key is the creativity within that. Do we have the writing schemes? Do we have the production schemes? Are we able to support that in a sustainable fashion? But also, are we able to fund it? And so there are two, I think, streams of work and evolution that we need to maintain here. And I think from a UK perspective, it really starts with the writing. And I think all of the major players now are putting in incredible schemes to ensure that our writing becomes more diverse, more inclusive. We're working with ScreenSkills at the moment. We recently onboarded apprentices into our show Cobra 2, which is filming in Manchester. We've got a writing partnership with New Writing North to nurture talent in Blackpool, Gateshead, Rotherham. We're working with National Theatre Wales with Bad Wolf. So, and we're not the only ones. Everybody's doing these kind of things. So we need to layer in the writing talent at the core and make sure it's more diverse and more inclusive than ever. We have incredible production skills in the UK, not least because for decades we've been running some of the best run soaps in the world. You know, these are superb training grounds for skills. And you see some great, superb writers coming out of those kind of factories. And, you know, Sky doesn't, we don't make soaps. We have no intention of doing so, but we're really glad they're there. You know, great for our skill base. On the funding side, and I think I agree with Wayne in that there is a cultural sense of evolution and almost mischievousness in the way that we approach narrative in the UK. And I think that is attractive to very mature markets like the US. But I avoid seeing the US as an either or. I think it's an as well as, and it's a very necessary as well as. Because if you look at one of the reasons actually that the UK is also attractive to shoot here is the fact that the cost per hour is less than the US. We can produce a fine, high quality hour of production at a better price point than you can in the States for all sorts of reasons. So that's a great thing. That's attracting American programming to be shot and produced in the UK. But in terms of the content that we're actually producing in the UK, whether it's Sky, Sony, whomever. For some time now, a US partner has been a very important part of our funding. And, you know, last year at Sky, for instance, we had 29 productions going to the States with either co-pros or pre-sale deals with 15 different networks and platforms. And thank goodness for them, because the price per hour of a current Sky original is significant. And we thankfully were attached to NBCU, who do a wonderful job of our international sales, but there is a ceiling on the amount of a show can make in the international marketplace. And as we have improved the quality of our shows, the budgets have increased, and so have the deficits. So I think we're in a very interconnected world right now where we need each other significantly. The US, thank goodness, sees the UK as an exciting market, and all 4 nations as well, which is fantastic. But equally, we still need the US for a lot of our funding. And I think that's really interesting on a creative level as well, because you're seeing the rise of the local voice, as you see. Even Netflix now is making more and more country-specific productions. But the need for the global funding model has also improved our world in terms of those big universal pieces. Those world-building productions, which have a much broader appeal across the world. And examples from Sky are shows like Britannia, Riviera, that kind of thing. We've got a new sci-fi show coming up this year called Intergalactic. Now, those are world-building shows, which a lot of entities are now producing, as well as the local. So I think we've got an increasingly nuanced and complex world.
Absolutely.
It's not binary. It's certainly not binary.
Absolutely right. I'm going to come back on one thing you mentioned there, which is the cost per hour. Is one of the reasons, is that a primary reason, Wayne? Is that a primary reason why the US come here? And if it is based on a cost per hour, does that cost per hour get squeezed in time?
I mean, obviously, it's one of the reasons they come here, and one of the reasons, the tax credit has really helped. And also, it's very difficult in America to make low-cost production. There's a whole load of guilds and everything else that we talk about. So yeah, that's obviously really important. And then when they come here, the experience is good, because there are certain places in the world who can forget the time we made Robin Hood in Budapest and the tapes got stolen, that famous story. At least we have the rule of law in the UK. That helps.
I'm going to come back on another thing as well you mentioned, which is about the making the global local, I think is the slogan, isn't it? But it's notable that Netflix is also following quite a large operation in Spain, in Madrid, to service the Latin markets. Do you see that Netflix going down a channel where it is more localized content, and what does that look like for the UK?
Well, I mean, Netflix's second biggest market is Brazil, and they're going to pour a load of money into Brazil. But there's no doubt, and this comes back to my earlier point that I was trying to make, which is there's different price points from around the world. So if you can get a show like La Casa out of Spain at a very low price point, and it does your job in that particular domestic market, and by the way, it becomes a hit elsewhere, that's a very happy model. And there's undoubtedly that the model for all these streaming services going through is, of course they do, because they're businesses, how can we lower the cost of production? How can we spend less and get more? And so consequently, yeah, they will be looking to those territories. But I'm quite taken with Jane's been very articulate in the last few years at saying in conferences like this about the traditional deficit models don't really stack up anymore. She was calling an alarm call at that a couple of years before most people realised, I think, and she's absolutely right. But at the same time, of course, what you do want is that patchwork of funding, and people do think, of course, as well. One thing I would say about, I'm rambling a bit, but one thing, don't think that the streaming services don't want British content. I got quite annoyed with that Enders analysis thing the other week, as I told them, because it was such a sort of, we can measure Britain. It's a British show if they buy a coffee from I don't know, a British coffee chain, but if they buy it from Starbucks, it's international. It's a load of bollocks. And the thing is, if you look at even something like A Very English Scandal, which was a big hit that we made a couple of years ago, That was a BBC license fee, but it was Amazon in the US who came in and they believed in that. And by the way, who would have thought a show about a Liberal MP and all the things that went around that would work? So don't think that they want local, actually, because it's the universality within the local that works.
If I can, I'm just to explain that the Enders analysis piece was about this idea of Britishness in production and what constitutes British or not. I have to say that's there are a number of people who've questioned the algorithms on that and the definition of what is British or not. I think Jane was commenting to me about how, if you went to Costa Coffee or Starbucks, which one is British, which one is not. But within that British idea, I'm going to come back at it a little bit, because the Americans have been doing this forever and a day, which is that they've been creating drama where the city in which that drama takes place, and America is very different from east to west coast, let alone from one state to another. It isn't one big homogenous whole, just in the same way as the UK isn't one big homogenous whole. And yet they've been making drama which is in whichever city it happens to be in, based on the aerial shot at the beginning of the show. It's not really that location dependent. We've been doing the same recently, I think, and Behind Her Eyes, which is one of yours, Wayne, it would be a great example where we've actually found a language of cipher for a middle-class cipher, and that same character and that same story could be picked up from London in the case of Behind Her Eyes, and it could be the same story in a grey clapperboard detached house in a cul-de-sac in Detroit, and the same story and the same characterization, fundamental characterization, would hold true. So this idea of Britishness and the need to be British, I question it, not just in terms of, is that the case? I beg to differ, but also in the question of, is that desirable?
Well, and also, I mean, they picked up, thank you for mentioning Behind Her Eyes, which is an amazing hit, actually, which I think has surprised us all in a really good way. But I was also mindful, people always have a pop at sex education because, well, it's very American. Well, sex education, apart from the fact famously Channel 4 turned it down, was redesigned by the program makers before they went to America. As Laurie and that was the show they wanted to make. So why? And I had this argument with them, because actually, if you're a Briton of a certain age, your take on culture is completely different. What someone of my age might think is American culture turns out to be actually the culture of a particular generation. It's absolute nonsense. But more importantly, what do we want to be? What do we want to be as programmers? We want to make stories that people around the world love. One of the greatest moments of my life, I was in Mexico and I was talking to a guy who runs Azteca. We were having dinner and he said to me, why am I, as a Mexican Jew, so fascinated and in love with the crown? And that was after season 1. And that's when something like that happens, I can wait to ring Peter Morgan and tell him, because that's what you want. And that's what our creatives want. That's what our business, we want to be a dominant international player. And that means some things you do are very British, because that, believe it or not, kind of works. And other things have a more international feel because you're talking to a different audience. So, yeah.
Isn't drama about human stories?
Yeah.
Jane, what do you think on this Britishness, this idea of being British and the importance?
Well, I was kind of intrigued by the Enders analysis, but I found their methodology a bit clunky. They measured Britishness by certain phrases. And one of the shows they studied was Save Me, our show, which is a brilliant thriller set in South London, and is full of a certain vernacular, not least because it was written by Lenny James in a very specific way. Audiences internationally now are becoming more and more sophisticated. You see shows like Gomorrah, which is Italian mafia show, again, very, very rooted in its world. Has had, a huge audience worldwide. So it's about making the local universal and not the other way around. Not finding universal themes and making them parochial. Now that's always a bad move.
And I was also thinking, you remember there always be a joke, didn't there, about American cities have really sexy titles. Benny Bragg used to be good, you can write, on the way to San Jose, you can't do on the way to Rochdale, etc. What we sometimes forget is actually we're kind of sexy. Actually, there's lots of things around the world. People want to, Manchester, a city I love, is regarded around the world in one place as a very aspirational place to want to come, and not to mention London and everywhere else. So let's not underplay. If you're in America, San Jose doesn't sound sexy, but perhaps Rochdale does. I don't know.
Well, again, if I can, I'm going to come out. This idea of characterization as well, isn't it? And isn't yeah, and to use a slightly over-articulated expression, it's the objective correlative of being able to identify with a character almost immediately. For example, if someone has a cigarette, you know that they're a baddie, that kind of thing. And hasn't Britain got better at doing that rather than having to tell the story of who that character is over a period of time? It's our writing skills, isn't it? And that's about universal humanity, Jane.
Well, I think this year we've seen some extraordinary, brave and really bold series. And one of which is I Hate Susie, which is a series, which is a Sky original, written by Lucy Prebble and starring Billie Piper. And that story skirts around a character. I mean, at the beginning of the show, you are invited to dislike this person. The setup, you know, the character is an actor. She's having a day of photos. She lives in that rarefied world. You're kind of invited to dislike her. Her world then falls apart when photos appear on the internet. You can guess what they might be. And that story just takes you to a place where you are initially really invited to dislike them, but somehow the quality of the writing draws you in, and it is quite a thrill ride. You know, it is so enjoyable, that show, but you are tense the whole time because you're so in it, because it's empathetic. You are in her shoes, even though you don't know her world at all. You are in her shoes.
It's identifying with that character and having a relationship with that character from the outset, absolutely, and developing that story too. And also, what could be more British than The Crown, which seems to be doing phenomenally well overseas? There's nothing more British than Her Madge, is there? Let's be frank. So, if I can, and we're going to canter through some big subjects now, because otherwise we're going to lose our time slot. So, thinking about streamer deals, what's attractive about streamer deals, Jane, and what's less attractive about them?
Well, it depends for whom. So if you're talking about if you're a producer, then the all rights deal at the outset means that your profit margin, such as it is baked in on day one. Now, after years of retaining rights in the UK since the Broadcasting Act changed in the early 2000s, British indies have had a great opportunity to own their own destiny because they've been able to retain control of their rights and exploit them internationally. In come the streamers, and there's a bit of harumphing going on because I can't keep my rights, but then you realise initially those deals from the streamers offered maybe up to 130% of a budget, and that looked quite attractive, or it can look quite attractive. Then I think what followed was a kind of binary discussion about rights or no rights. You either get a deal from the BBC or you get a deal from Netflix, and each have their advantages and disadvantages. But I think there is a sweet spot in the middle. I think it is attractive for production companies sometimes to work for the streamers because those all rights deals mean that you do see your margin up front, and that can be very helpful for your working capital as a producer, especially a small producer. And then retain rights with the linear platforms in the conventional way, and hopefully you see an upside from yourself.
A mixed ecology is the important thing here.
I think the mixed ecology is helpful for producers, yes. And the other thing that I said just recently is, you know, with these increasing deficits in a show, if you are a small producer producing a very large show on a high budget with a significant deficit, you might not see a return on that. If you retain the rights in that show, you may not see a return on that the exploitation for many years. And in that case, an all rights deal might be attractive. As far as the streamers are concerned, in terms of deal making with other platforms, it's a challenge. Now, it's only a challenge because we're both in the same markets with the same type of content in the same type of platform. So, for instance, Sky in our European markets, where we have our own, you know, Sky Italy, Germany, UK, it's very difficult for us to share in rights with the streamers in those markets because we both need premium exclusive rights. Now, that means that's okay. You know, it's not that we're at war with the streamers. We just are doing the same thing in those marketplaces. And I think that will increasingly, we will need to concentrate increasingly on premium and exclusive rights. So for a while, producers were able to do very good business by windowing their programming between a premium pay and a terrestrial. But I think where you have increasingly competitive D2C platforms in a single market, it's going to be very difficult for those shows to be shared. And what you'll probably have is a premium pay or D2C SVOD deal, and then much later down the line you might get a second window. So I think it's putting a premium on exclusive rights, and then that really changes the economics of how you think about funding a show. But it's, once again, phrase for the day, it's certainly not binary. It's kind of much more nuanced market than it used to be.
I'm going to come to you, Wayne, on that point, actually. This idea of, there's two things here, really. One is the value that can be found within indies. And when we were talking before, I was asking you about, is this a rich man's club now? Is it a super indies club? And does it cut out the smaller indie? And and again, the value in that indie going forward, all within the same breath, is to be found in residual rights. If the value in that indie,
I mean, James' point is a good one, and it's one we stress. We regard our businesses as portfolio businesses in some sense, I guess. Yeah, we'll do a deal like that because we get the rights in and Jane's right. If you're a small indie, because of the changing nature of the marketplace, I mean, actually, unscripted formats are quite interesting. So the traditional thing was you went and created the format, you sold it to the BBC, they bought it, you retained all the rights, you went with the distributor, you flogged it around the world, and it was a hit. But there haven't been any hit non-scripted formats really of any real scale for quite some time. So consequently now, if you go and sell it, if you go and make a show to Netflix, your thing is you're probably only going to get 1-2 seasons if you're lucky, because it churns through these non-scripted. But you will, as Jane says, you'll get the cash flow, you'll get a nice premium. It won't matter to 130, but it'll be significant and it really helps you. So that's great if you're a small indie. But I think that the real issue that we have, and the shake-up of the last year, we'll begin to see that soon, is we've probably got oversupply of producers in our market. And you certainly see this in drama. And the other thing about the streamers, of course, is they don't have to talk to everyone. Whereas if you're the BBC, ITV or Channel 4, you've got to talk to everyone who sends you an idea, which is one of the reasons they're so slow in getting back on decision making. I think there'll be a shakedown. I think you'll see the bigger indie. There'll be more consolidation, inevitably. People have got to somehow share costs. And I think it'll be the middle that will get squeezed, in my view. I think you'll still have small, you'll have not lifestyle, that's a bit unfair, but you could have a very good life making one drama a year for a streaming or whatever. But it's the middle ground that I think is going to get squeezed.
Jane, you're nodding your head. And what are your thoughts on indies and which ones? Where do you need to sit within that indies hierarchy, as it were?
Well, I completely agree with Wayne on this one. I think it's be wary of the squeezed middle. It's very clear that a small drama indie particularly can do very, very well. I mean, the way that drama is put together, it can be put together from a small base. I mean, if you look at everything that Jane Featherstone has done, huge world-beating shows, a relatively small base company. So I think it isn't a size means everything in drama particularly. I think in factual ent, I agree. In formats particularly, a certain amount of infrastructure helps build the conceits and formats that need to be robust in order to have a long life internationally. So I think there are probably too many production companies. At Sky, we sit somewhere between the streamers and the PSBs, in the sense that we don't have the same public service remit as BBC, ITV, Channel 4, but we are making real efforts at the moment to increase the number of production companies we work with. Last year, we worked with 14 more production companies than we had done previously, with Hartswood and with Expectation. I think that's important for us to maintain that sense that we're giving back to the industry as well. But it is difficult. It's very, very difficult. As Wayne said, quite how the BBC sifts through thousands of submissions is really hard to it's really hard to understand. And I think there has been I mean, I think the consolidation of production businesses over the last 10 years has made millionaires of some people. I think we've seen a kind of overdue kind of recalibration in the marketplace now. And I think, as always, you know, a sector gets greedy. We gorge on success and then have to reset and recalibrate. And I think that's what's happened with the proliferation of indies, that everybody thought they could flip their company within 3 years and then set up again and flip it again. And that is running out of steam.
Which leads me on to a question really about breaking into this market. And on the one hand, yes, the Communications Act made millionaires out of many people at the expense of Channel 4. On the other hand, you know, looking at people breaking into the market, I was talking to an executive producer who'd done a very big series for Apple. And he had to find, you know, rather than be able to set up on his own, even though he was bringing that to Jay Hunt, and instead he had to sit within an umbrella large indie, part of a super indie, to make sense of that. How do people?
That's always happened.
Well, how do people break in?
Well, that's nothing new, actually. That's how they're breaking in. They're a small indie, they haven't got the infrastructure, they haven't got the reputation. Jay's taken a gamble on them and said, I mean, she's minimising the risk of failure. That's a win.
No sense of criticism here. And my point is really, what happens to those smaller indies? How do those smaller indies get to grow within this new world?
You're suggesting that small indie is the nirvana here, not necessarily owning your own indie. There are different ways of doing this. And I think we've got into a mindset where a producer can only maximize their cultural, editorial and commercial value in a marketplace if they own their own indie. The fact is that quite a lot of producers are terrible at running businesses, but they're brilliant at making shows. So we need to kind of set up the infrastructure to enable the best of that. Now, if you do want to set up your indie, that's brilliant, and I want to work with you. But we're currently at Studios, we're at Sky Studios, we're trying to lay in lots of different deal types that serve the purposes of the individual. Now, in some cases, we're doing what the Americans call an overall deal, where you kind of preferred services and allow that producer to set up their own slate. We do development deals. We're doing more and more script deals, all sorts, a kind of complete plethora of different types of deals. But they're designed to assist the individuals involved and make the most of them. And not everybody wants to be ordering the loo paper and the stationery and everything else that comes with running an indie. So I would urge, you know, talented people who want to kind of set up on their own in some way, if they want to be seen, owning your own company isn't the only way. You know, going to a large company like Sony or Sky or BBC and getting a kind of in-house deal, which also enables you to do third-party shows, could be exactly what you want, because it liberates you from having to order the loo paper. But you can just spend all your day, you know, developing and writing and whatever. So I think there is an obsession that, and there's a kind of assumption that unless you own your own indie, you're not successful. But that is not the case at all.
It is an industry, if I may comment, it is an industry led by salespeople across the board, is it not? I look at big, successful indies, they're very good salespeople at the helm. If I look at the supply chain, they tend to be very good salespeople at the helm, rather than necessarily operational talent or creative talent. You know, it is an important prerequisite to be able to sell the show, to be able to sell the program. I'm going to come back on one final point, because we're going to move on to how we make this all work. And Seetha's been very quiet here, so I'd like to bring her back into the debate. The importance of PSB to this model, to our continued success. I'm going to start with you, Jane, about the importance of PSB, move on to Wayne, and then on to Seetha and Roger. Why is the strength of our PSB model so important to our future, or is it so important to our future?
Well, it's a difficult one for Sky to answer, really.
Well, that's why it's good to start with you, right?
Look, personally, I'm a big supporter of the BBC and the licence fee. That's my personal view. At Sky, as I said, we sit somewhere between the two, and actually we have benefited extraordinarily from the PSB tradition. Because we have been able to work with the best talent that has been nurtured, a healthy marketplace, because as I said before, the change of the Broadcasting Act, the Communications Act in 2003 actually revolutionise the world for production businesses and able to own their own destiny. And we are the recipients we are the beneficiaries of that now. It's also encouraged, you know, at Sky, we in terms of the deals we offer, the way we work with indies, we are very influenced by those deals first set up by the PSBs. It is important that we give fair value. It is important that we offer diversity and inclusion. Now, those things aren't the sole preserve of PSB. You can be a private business and still support those things, as we do at Sky. But I think we are definitely the beneficiaries of that decades-long public service remit that we have imbued, with which we've imbued our cultural sector.
Wayne, I'm going to pass on to you the continued importance of the PSB within this model, and also bringing in CoPro as well, for that matter.
Look, it is important, and we've got a unique ecology in the UK which underpins why we've been so successful in scripted and unscripted content around the world. But the thing is, the world is changing, and I often wonder, particularly in government, that I don't think they get it. I don't think they get, you've seen this in the pandemic really in some ways, they don't really understand how the whole thing, you know, works, whether it's the theatres and live music, and it all feeds into this cultural creativity within Britain. It's all interlinked, and it's very difficult to argue it because it's very difficult to illustrate how it works. And I worry that we are in danger of throwing out public service broadcasting, and for extraordinary short-sighted reasons. And we have a history in this country of doing the wrong thing for short-sighted reasons, and people, a minority, somehow get more airtime, newspaper time than they deserve to put their case, and that will undermine public service broadcasting and eventually our ecosystem.
And to be fair to the BBC, I think it's had some phenomenal successes in drama and high-end television recently.
Yeah. The BBC is a very frustrating, and I worked there for 12 years. It's a very frustrating organisation, but somehow it works, and somehow year after year, great content comes through. I mean, it's almost inexplicable, and yet it happens. So it must be getting something right.
And if I can, I'm going to pass on to you, Seetha, but I'm going to reframe the question. If the PSB model, that training ground for PSB, you know, let's go back, I don't know, 40 years prior to Channel 4, where all broadcasting was done by the studio, by the broadcaster, in-house production facilities, the whole shooting match, and then, you know, it was all disrupted by Channel 4 in '82. You know, thinking about it now, if the PSB funding and expenditure is decreasing and declining, yet the demand for talent, as we established at the beginning, is predicted to go up and double, how can PSB of itself be the driver of that knowledge base, of that skill set, of that writing talent? You know, when we were talking before, we were talking about John East, for example, and how he spent so many years on EastEnders, and you know, before going and doing Killing Eve and doing more recently Pennyworth. You know, how does that talent learn, grow, be nurtured within lower cost, lower risk, no offense to the soaps, content, if that money isn't there to support that content either? And what do we need to put in place to replace that?
So lots of very big questions. I agree with Wayne. I think you need the entire ecosystem to work together. And what's happening more and more, and we use that word quite loosely at the moment, convergence, the convergent world. And I would use in there theatre as well, because there's always been a porousness of talent between the two. Storytelling, and across the different genres and forms and formats, whether it's daytime, because you hone your teeth and experience sometimes in working very quickly, because they're risky shows, you can get it wrong, you make your mistakes, you're protected. I think that ecosystem of scripted, unscripted, children's, low-cost drama, then slightly mid-cost drama, that whole, you know, it is quite difficult to explain to an outsider, but it works and it fuses and supports each other.
The incentive at the moment that's driven this all forward has been the tax credits you get for film production and also high-end TV production. So they have actually managed to keep our industry going. There was a slight setback with the removal of EIS finance for the British small production finance to make independent movies. But the inward investment now is driven, I think, by these tax incentives, and long may they last. Obviously, other countries are catching up. I mean, you have great tax incentives, for instance, in Hungary. You have tax incentives elsewhere. So it is interesting how we have to stay on our toes if we wish to keep this sort of business, because we are now talking about international players, and they wonderfully selected the UK as being start of their great journey. And let's hope we can keep them here on that great journey.
Well, if I can, I'm going to cut across to Seetha here, because the government has been very instrumental in supporting the UK film and TV industry, and particularly the television industry. It's not just the tax incentives, is it?
No, I would say it's the triple pillars of the tax incentives, as Roger's mentioned: studios, locations, and then obviously the workforce. I mean, let's not forget, for years, for decades, the creativity in front of camera and behind camera is something that's lauded globally. And this is something people come back here because we have craftsmen who worked on the most extraordinary blockbusters, whether it's film, because again, a lot of the genesis was in film, and currently in high-end TV. And that remains key. And the final thing I'd say is the English language.
Yes, absolutely. And I think language is going to be critical, isn't it, to the whole story here. Why on earth would the Americans come here if it weren't that we spoke the same language? They're not notorious for speaking foreign languages apart from Spanish. So thinking again, Roger, and what else would you say is instrumental in the UK, and thinking through the prism of studios as well?
Yeah, I think the dollar-pound relationship is very, very important. I keep talking about money, don't I? But I think it's very important to remember that we are a business. I know we're a creative business, but we are a business. And so investment in product, and I call it products. I always remember the Carlton Television changed the whole thing from production to product. And they said, we're making product. And I just think that in the production of product in the UK, we're a fantastic service business. We create a lot for the inward investors. We're property in terms of the facilities we offer. I think in the States there are certain different working conditions, but they are building more stages, by the way, in Hollywood at this moment in time. Everything's expanding there, and there's some great tax incentives in the States now as well. So I think we have to be, as I say, on our toes. We have to ensure that we keep our workforce skilled, we keep them trained, we bring in young people into the industry. And I think one of the reasons why the Americans like working here, quite rightly, the language, the shopping. I even had one client wanted to know how far it was to Harvey Nicks. So you've got to bear in mind that when they've got top artists, top stars coming into the UK, they also have to be looked after. I mean, they cost a lot of money to bring in and invest in, and they have to be looked after. And they find the UK a great place to actually work. And when I say the UK, by the way, I mean all four nations. I don't just mean England, I mean the whole four nations. And so they work all over the UK. I think Seetha mentioned something else, which is very, very important, is the type of productions that are actually happening. And you have different reasons why people use studios. For instance, if you have a precinct drama, they tend to build a long-term set in the studio, or it's a continuous drama, etc. If they want great locations for the historic drama series, the UK can provide all that. So we have some great locations. And so not every production is shot in a studio. I think there's also, bear in mind, what a great infrastructure this country provides for production.
Yes, absolutely. And that infrastructure is broader than just transport, isn't it? And it encompasses communications, and it encompasses also, I think it's very relevant, is what happens down the road from Elstree in Soho, which is one of the world's largest networked post-production infrastructures, where they're all networked together and they're all within a stone's throw together in Soho and NoHo. And that, I think, is also a significant aspect to the UK's attraction. Plus, of course, if I can, Roger, and I'd like you to comment on VFX and what we did with the Harry Potter movies and where that takes us now.
Yeah, the VFX side is very interesting. Obviously, it's been generating a lot of income into the UK. And once again, I'm talking about money. It does generate a lot of income in the UK. The video effects departments are fantastic. I mean, you've got Frame Store and people like that, and Double Negative and people like that. So they've been doing great work. It's interesting to note in the States that some of the video effects companies have actually sort of disappeared. Yeah. You've got Lucas, obviously, Industrial Light and Magic out there. You've got all those elements. So it's a very important part of our industry, and it's something that we should actually be making people more aware of, because it requires a certain different type of work in that industry. I think we're talking about here digital and industries, and we do need to train up more people to maintain that workflow in the video effects side, which is expanding rapidly.
Well, it's worth noting, isn't it, that in the VFX sector, they're attracting work which is American originated, shot in America, and attracting work over in the UK to fulfill various frames and clips and sequences. So it's not even work that's shot in the UK that's getting that VFX dollar. So let's bring it back to studios for a second. We talk about studios in our studios, but the studios, there was a famine for quite a number of years, in TV studios and in film studios. You had Fountain Studios go, Capital Group Studios go, Teddington Studios, London Studios, all of those went. And you had a kind of famine, and people ended up, I remember talking to a raft of heads of production. They were talking about how they had to go to the Neasden carpet factory and what a grim experience that was. Bringing that forward, we've now got, the last count I had was over 100 studios in planning and development across the UK, many of which go live this year, next year, and the year after. Is that sustainable, Roger? And that strikes me as being famine to feast, from a seller's to a buyer's market.
You mentioned studios have gone. Obviously, I was one of the owners of Teddington Studios. And at the end of the day, I keep talking about money. The value of the land where a lot of studios were located was worth more to the investors than the income that they actually made. And so they were sold off. And so if you take Fountain, it's due for development. Teddington is a block of flats. Bray was due to be developed as houses. So we've got a whole load of studios that have actually disappeared simply because of the requirement for land and where they were located. One of the great things about what's happening at the moment is those studios probably would have been inappropriate, by the way, for a lot of the productions that are currently happening. There is a sort of quantum size that you need for certain types of production. And there is also the need for a certain size of stage, a certain height of stage, and a certain infrastructure around it that's required. So the investors that are coming in are realizing that there is a need for a studio complex. Now, there is an interim situation at this moment in time, and the British Film Commission are currently looking not just at the new builds, but they're looking at the repurposed warehouses. You mentioned the Neasden carpet warehouse, which was a disaster. But there are a number of places that are being repurposed, warehouses that are being repurposed, and they're trying to fulfill the current requirement, because there is actually a shortage. You're quite right. There is a huge amount of investment going into new studio builds. In fact, we're spending a fortune here at Elstree building some new stages. And of course, Sky Studios Elstree, just up the road, will be a fantastic complex, giving lots of work and lots of production opportunities within Bournemouth. So I think one of the things is that huge investment has to pay back. Now, the difference with Sky Studios Elstree, which is part of that wonderful Comcast group, which includes Universal, Working Title, and Carnival and Focus, I believe. Is that, have I done it right there, Jane? It's a great group, and it's a production studio, right? So it's like the old Hollywood studios where they produce their own content. Whereas, and Leavesden's the same. Leavesden is Warner Brothers, and it's a production studio. But a lot of these new studios coming into the market are what I call open market studios, so they're bookable. So there will be, I think, in a couple of years' time, a dearth of new studios, but ironically, around the perimeter of London. Mm-hmm. A lot of incentive is currently going on to move production out of the southeast and more into the regions. So I think we may find that there may be some political moves to actually sort of push production more into the regions. So it'll be very interesting how these new studios cope with that.
Well, also it's about what is a studio beyond just real estate, isn't it? A studio is the sum of the parts. it's about connectivity, it's about the lot as well, and what you have surrounding that studio complex. If it's just a warehouse, then that's a fairly limited offer, isn't it?
It needs a lot of joined up thinking by the DCMS and people like Seetha involved and everybody involved in the industry, because I think we have to understand what actually a production actually is. I mean, things in running a studio is to try to understand what your clients actually need and what they want and what the production actually needs, and try to provide it. And I think one of the problems is that the real estate investors currently coming in are not necessarily people from the film and television industry. And they, as you quite rightly, James, has said, they are investing in real estate. And they consider it being something that they want to climb onto because they've seen the money that actually has been made in the studio business. Mind you, I've got to say something about the studio business. It's not a business that makes a fortune. You can increase the value of the land, right? And so ultimately, if you sold the land, you could make a lot of money because you've increased the value of the land. But the studio business itself is quite a marginal business. It's not because the size of the investment. If you're talking about 300, 400 million going into building a studio complex, that's a lot of money to pay back. That's a lot of money to pay back on the rate card.
Well, if I can, I'm going to bring back a couple of those ideas and take it a little bit forward here. You know, so one of it is, who are those investors? So, and I think if I can, I'm going to look at another example with Seetha here, which is Dagenham Studios, which is Hackman money, I think it is, isn't it? Which is basically US studios-related investment company coming over to the UK and putting a lot of money into a new studios complex. And it's not just, again, the studios, the real estate, the four walls, the lot. It's also the infrastructure around it, which is people. And I think this is a really key point. I'm going to come back to you, Roger, about the Elstree people as well, and what surrounds the studios, again, kind of like a layered approach, isn't it? It comes out concentric rings around the studio. Seetha, what's happening at Dagenham?
So at Dagenham, you've got MBS, as you know, and we actually did some initial mapping looking at what is the workforce likely to be needed. And to Roger's point, what kind of complex does Barking and Dagenham want it to be? We're also talking to Liverpool and Bristol, because Bristol, I think, Bottle Yard is expanding. And Roger's point, there is quite a lot of focus in terms of out of London hubs. I think the overarching point I want to make is, as you think about studio growth and any projected growth of the sector, we do need to think about what kind of workforce we need, not just in terms of numbers, but the right volume in certain skilled areas. Because in our world, our currency is experience. I'm talking about workforce. I also want to make a slightly more controversial point in terms of visual effects, which is this. Computer generated content has been one of the fastest growing. And if you look at the stats, it was, I think, 156 billion in 2020. And by that, I include visual effects, animation, and games. Now, it's one of those cross-pollination industry where the technologies bleed into each other. Roger's right, you know, the visual effects companies in London have done incredibly well. But if you look at the tax credit regime, quite a lot of the growth is happening. The hubs are happening in Chennai, Vancouver, because we're not as competitive as we like to think.
Yes.
The other point I'd like to make is that we do need to think, as we do productions that are more and more ambitious, what is the kind of creativity we need, and what is that blend of creative and technology, which goes back to workforce and goes back to the kind of skill base we need. And we need businesses and people here, because otherwise people are portable, they'll move. We do need stickiness here, and I think we need that thought through, and we can do it, but we do need to think it all through in that structured way. I mean, Roger mentioned virtual production. COVID has seen such significant changes in workflow, whether it's in post-production, remote working, or introduction of virtual production, not just in terms of sport. Obviously, Mandalorian set the stage. There was Midnight Sky that's just done recently by Netflix, and there's more coming.
Absolutely, and we're going to come on to that subject because it's key, and it's a knowledge-based economy, and that is actually one of the primary things that the UK has to offer. And I think we need to explore that, and we will, because it's important. But coming back to the people and the training around the studios, you know, Roger, you wear another hat as governor of the UTC, which is the college in Elstree, and of course there's Oaklands as well as another opportunity for training and delivering people into that studio sector. How does that work, and what's the thinking at your end?
Well, I was the founder of the UTC with the idea of being a film school, but for 14 to 19-year-olds, if you like. And so we managed to get government money, and it's a vocational college for the film, TV and theatre sector, by the way, because the skills are transferable. And the idea is that we have a normal curriculum for the education side, and we have the vocational piece as well. We are, ironically, we had a meeting yesterday. We are trying to form a collective. When I say a collective, it's actually involves ScreenSkills, it involves UK Screen Alliance, it involves the British Film Commission, it involves Sky Studios Elstree, it involves our good selves, Elstree Studios, and the BBC, and it involves Leavesden. And the idea is that we all will talk and work together to find solutions to what we consider to be something in the future, which will be a major problem, which is the skills shortage. And we want to ensure that the skills that are taught are the ones that are appropriate for the people who are going to use them. So we don't want people to work in isolation. We want people to all work together. The college has been very successful in terms of UTCs. A lot of UTCs have actually failed, sadly. But this one, this creative one, has been a good model. We hope to transfer that model to other areas of the UK. What we want to do is encourage local authorities and the DFE to actually look at vocational colleges in the regions that we can feed from Elstree. It's called Elstree Screen Academy, by the way, and we can feed from there to the regions. The pandemic has actually given us something else, which is we've been quite successful at the Elstree Screen Academy with distance learning. And we want to see if we can take those modules and use it as a sort of open university, if you like, for the creative industries, where we can actually pump out those models to the regions so people can actually sort of work, if you like, a distance learning from the college. And hopefully that will not just affect 14 to 19-year-olds, it will also be something for people who are repurposing their work experience, because obviously a lot of freelancers have actually dropped out of the industry or have been left out of the industry. And there are a lot of people who need to repurpose what they do. By combining, if you like, the creative industries with a decent education and a vocational education, we can have a workforce that is appropriate for this century.
No, absolutely. And coming up, and I think that the key point here is it's a joined up approach. A studio isn't just four walls. It's what surrounds the studio on the lot. It's about the talent base that's available to feed into it, which we're going to come on to now. And it's about bringing new skills and new people into that offer as one joined up approach across the UK.
Ours has been an utterly disruptive world. If I look at the changes we've all seen in our lifetime, whether it's in business model or creative technology, it constantly reinvents itself. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to constantly do that. In that, the key thing is, how do we make sure the skills and knowledge are shared? And by that, I mean, it's Jane's point, you know, a lot of people don't have leadership skills. A lot of people don't have business acumen. So sometimes it's that element of acknowledging what you do know and what you don't know. My big beef about all of this is that we've started doing this, and I think there is a moment and an opportunity. The world is turning. There's a lot of change happening. There will be more disruption. There may be, you know, companies that collapse. There will be new skills and capabilities needed. If we in the UK want to play our global role, and I think that is a brilliant combination of domestic storytelling, whatever that might mean in different forms, and storytelling for the international market, but in the end, it's the human experience, that involves a range and breadth of skills. So I kind of feel we need to almost look forward and do what I call future casting and think, what are the types and things we want to do, and work backwards and think in a really disciplined way. What are the skills and talent we need? Skills and talent you need for the workforce now, and what are the skills and talent that you need for the workforce to be the future skills? Because that could go like that. We are a competitive ecology.
I'd like to cut across on that, because one of the initiatives you took, which I think is illustrative of this and brings in a slightly different theme as well, is technology and virtual production. And you know, ScreenSkills has been very instrumental in seeing that space, acting quickly and ahead, because you know, virtual production to most of us looks like it's 12, 18 months ahead before it gets any real pace to it. You know, Mandalorian accepted. Yeah, but what have you done there? How does that model work? And what has ScreenSkills done to make that model work?
So I think this is a very good example of why in this country, despite all the different things we come together, it's very rare to find a body like ours elsewhere. We are entirely led by the industry. We've got all the key players, and everything we do is informed by the sector. We work with skills councils and we work with working groups. We're very practitioner led. We're also data driven. For the last couple of years, what we've been trying to do is ask the people on the ground, what is the skills you need today? Where do you need support, and how do we support you? And that covers a myriad kind of range of skills, from whether it's leadership management, because if you're a DOP that suddenly has to manage 7 other DOPs and across multiple locations, it requires a different capability set. And you've got to then think, what does that mean? And how do you support people? That's really key. The other thing is, because we're very close to what's happening, and during the pandemic, we pivoted online and we did 2 or 3 things. We actually focused on the kind of skills and knowledge people needed, because it's a freelance workforce. And so we don't have that structure. And how can we be the body that provides structure, pathways, clarity, particularly given the importance of inclusion and given the importance of actually making sure I come back to the right skills and the right numbers. Because there is no point saying we've got the right skills if the costs are going to go up, or if you haven't got the backfill coming up behind you. So all of that's really important. And what we've been doing is working in this unified way. And a challenge we have in our country is that everyone reinvents the wheel every so often. And so within the skills space, we're constantly herding cats and trying to say, look, we're doing this in a structured, disciplined way. Please don't go and reinvent the wheel and think it hasn't been done before, because actually we're wasting time and effort. So that kind of industrial business-like approach is critical. Coming back to virtual production, what was very clear, and it was clear pre-COVID, but because we're very close to what's going on, we did quite a lot of sessions trying to understand how people were making programs during COVID, and what we call them producing during COVID. The key thing was shared knowledge and experience. How quickly do you disperse it to a freelance workforce? We were very fortunate. The industry is utterly generous. So practitioners would come and tell us actually what they did and how they did. And there were sessions we did. We did one with Jamie Heinhoff of BT, and he talked about using virtual studios. And it was very clear, because I would sit in on quite a lot of these sessions, and I'm quite lucky because I come from a production background. I have a lot of people in my organization who come from a practitioner background. So you kind of see very quickly what's going to happen. And then the next thing was then really talking to the visual effects company, which I did. It wasn't difficult because we're very connected, as I said, to the industry. And you kind of knew what was going to happen. So you jump on it and think, okay, where do we want to position ourselves? And that's why I come back to constantly, where do we want to place our bets in the future? What is the right skill base we need? What is the knowledge base we need? Because we can work in a systematic way to achieve that. And Roger's right. We have a lot of work to do across the education pipeline, because there is a chasm that exists between what colleges and universities provide and what the sectors need. Partly because our sector is disruptive and is changing rapidly, partly because I have worked briefly in the education world. The education world moves slowly. It has different pulls and pressures. So it's how do you broker that? And more practically, how do you get much more of a vocational, practical induction into this industry? Because in our industry, you learn through doing.
If I can cut across there, it's skills fit for purpose. I think the classic was VFX. For many, many years, where the training courses in the universities were on applications that weren't actually required in the real world. And UK Screen, and if I can bring them in as well as another example that you work closely with, have done a great job of mentoring. And again, this feeds into the generosity of the industry, because the mentoring's been done by companies like The Mill and Framestore, mentoring the future VFX operators at a local level. And they've embraced that, and it's been a fantastic process. And of course, they are introduced to the talent of tomorrow. And it comes back to that PSB model again a little bit, though, because isn't that PSB the middle ground between that education and that coming up? And then there's the PSB in the middle ground before we get into the high-end television at the top, where that skill set is, well, there is no margin, or the margin for error is reduced within the labor force there, and it is a more unforgiving environment. We've touched upon technology, which is increasingly unforgiving at that high end, and is going through a seismic change in terms of expectation and requirement. but just in terms of that labour force and that skill set. Roger, I'm going to bring you in on this. And how do you connect UTC with working at Elstree?
Because we realise that a lot of the people in our industry, especially the people servicing high-end television and conventional television, and we do a lot of conventional television. The PSB is very important for Elstree Studios. We do a lot of daytime quiz shows. We do things like Strictly Come Dancing and all those sort of elements. And it's not just about drama. It's about the communication revolution that we've seen taking place, which, as Jane said, it resets itself every so often and carries on. And we have to have a way of training people. Now, the BBC used to have fantastic training courses, and they produce some of the best engineers and technicians. And there's a few colleges around that still do that. They don't necessarily make them fit for purpose, if you like. And a lot of modern technology requires different skills. And I always remember somebody trying to explain to me what spline mathematics was for graphic design. And I found that terribly complicated. But the whole thing really is how you actually make universities, colleges work to our industry requirements. There's a new courses out at the moment, the T levels, you've heard of the T levels they're introducing. Well, the T levels are not necessarily appropriate for some of our industry, and the GCSE levels are definitely not necessarily appropriate. So we're caught in a cleft stick because the DFE are thinking of removing funding for some of the elements that are currently appropriate for our industry. So we have to pursue this, not just as a studio and a UTC or a Screen Academy. We have to pursue it politically. I think we have to do what Wayne said earlier on, which is to try to make politicians understand what goes on in our world and to understand the importance of communications. And the other element there is the PSBs. They're very important in not just for drama and everything else, but for our whole communication platform. And they produce many other things other than drama. They also have radio programs, remember, as well, that they also produce, very well respected radio programs. There are radio programs they have that are a platform for a lot of young writers that are coming through. All those sort of elements come into play. So I think what we're trying to do is, if you like, be ahead of the game. It's very difficult to be ahead of the game because the game changes so rapidly, but to try to be ahead of the game by trying to actually sort of encompass the workforce of young people and to actually learn from their ideas, because they are actually going to colour what the industry looks like in 10 years' time. They are actually the people that are going to change the industry. They're going to change the viewing in the industry. They're the people that are actually going to influence what we make, what they make.
I'm hoping that this illustrious panel can all give from their own viewpoint, please, some advice to our viewers. And I think, if I may, from Wayne and Jane, I'm going to ask for advice to the indie community listening in. And from Seetha and Roger, I'm going to ask advice for the supply chain and the knowledge base that we need in the future. So I'm going to start with you, Jane, especially as you had your hand up there as well. And I'm conscious that it was there. So Jane, one piece. You've got 2 minutes, I'm afraid. Sorry. One piece of advice that you'd give an indie looking into this new world, this rapidly accelerating, changing world. What would you say to them if you wanted to tell them one idea, one thought?
Look forward, not backwards, in the sense that I think the kind of relationship you can have with platforms going forward, whether it's PSV, SVOD, premium pay television, I think those do not think binary, particularly in terms of your rights. There are many outcomes which could be very beneficial to you. Do not rely on old thinking in that regard. I think that training is vital. I think that diversity of voice is really important going forwards. So ensure that you work with the broadest spectrum of writing talent and try to help develop that. Think nations and regions, not just the metropolis. But I think mostly it's think forwards. I think we're at a point where we can be incredibly innovative right now. It feels like we're at some kind of a junction in television. I wouldn't get obsessed with whether you work with linear or on-demand platforms, because going forward, we're all going to be everything. So don't worry about it. That's a detail you don't need to sweat. That's for the platforms to work out. So it's forming the best relationship you can with the platform, understanding their customer base as well. Find out from them as much as possible about their own customer base. Who are they trying to attract? Is this, for instance, a show which you want, say for in Sky's case, is this a show that we call one for prospects, i.e. that you put on big billboards on the M4 and you on the entry to the M4, and you want new customers to sign up to Sky? Or is it intended to be a barnstorming pleaser that will please the majority of the customer base? Is it a show where we want to really dig into, lean forward, muscular narrative storytelling that will build profile and build quality? So I think understanding your customer, in the same way platforms need to understand their customer, whether that is the license fee payer in the case of the BBC or the subscriber in the case of Sky, I think that is true of indies too. And your customers are very varied right now. And just don't sweat whether it's linear, SVOD, or just talk to that platform and understand what they want.
Isn't it ironic that within this consolidating world that the business options available seem to be ever broader? I'm going to ask Wayne at this point, as perhaps the ultimate production studio with some of your hits. What would you say to your take-home thoughts for our indies tuning in?
Well, I think Jane's just bloody Millichip said everything, isn't she? She doesn't have anything to say, which everyone else will be relieved by, particularly the people watching this. I'd say, actually, what would I say? I would say, actually, okay, it's going to sound terribly cliche, think global by being local. Actually, understand, I mean, I say this to all our production companies around the world, that the wonderful thing about this world now is that it doesn't matter who you are, you can construct, design, create a story that will be watched around the world. That's at the same time, by the way, at the very same time. And that is a unique moment in history, in communications history and everything. And I think you want to be part of that, don't you? And that's the goal, to win. But you succeed there, I think, by being what you are, by understanding your environment and your culture and taking that onto that finding universal. So think global by being local, and see yourself as a global player, whether you're in London or you're in Aberdeen or wherever you are. Think that way.
Great. We have a slogan. I always like a slogan. We have a slogan. Seetha, I'm going to pass on to you. That final thought. I'm going to frame it with you, if I may, through this idea of sustainability. The biggest issue here is sustainability. We've got the studios. We've got some amazing production talent, although whether we have enough writing talent and enough and just cinematographers, for example, where there's a shortage as well. We've got that. What do we need to put in place to make us sustainable? And please, 2 minutes.
I will. So I'd say you cannot make great television or film without the people. We are a people-led industry. We're about skills and talent. You need to invest in people, because you will not get the oak without the acorn. Work with us to ensure we have a unified and structured approach to skills and talent. It will reap dividends, particularly if you want to build a diverse, inclusive workforce that's fit for purpose for the future. And finally, remember, this is a disruptive, creative, exciting sector. So for anybody who wants to enter, I'd say embrace creativity, embrace technology, understand business.
Fantastic. Another slogan. The oak without the acorn. Rog, I'm really sorry to pass on to you as the last one here. You've got to find a slogan, I'm afraid, mate. So if I can, let's thinking about the supply chain and how the supply chain rise to this occasion as well. What would be your take-home message to the supply chain?
We all have to talk together, either end of the spectrum, whatever the output is supposed to be. We all have to talk together, move together. We all have to provide for each other. And we also have to try to understand what each other needs. And I think that's the way we can grow it.
Fantastic. And very succinct, perfectly done. Gives me 30 seconds in which to wrap up and say a very, very big thank you to Seetha Kumar, CEO of ScreenSkills, to Jane Millichip, Chief Creative Officer at Sky Studios, to Wayne Garvie, President International Television at Sony Pictures, and to Roger Morris, Managing Director of Elstree. Guys, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.